Hello and welcome back to the Crime Folio. Thank you for joining us as we explore the darkest corners of human desire. Wealth is often seen as the ultimate Goala promise of security, comfort, and freedom. But for some, the promise is not enough. The weight for that wealth becomes unbearable. What happens when greed curdles into impatience, and the love of money eclipses the love of family? Tonight, we examine the chilling calculus of patricide, matricide, and murder, where the price of an inheritance is paid in blood. Case 1. The case of Sante and Kenny Kimes. Our story begins not with the killers, but with the prize. It is the summer of 1998 in New York City. On the Upper East Side, nestled among the city's most exclusive addresses, stands a magnificent 5-story limestone townhouse at 20 East 65th Street. It is a home worth an estimated $7 to $10 million, a fortress of old New York wealth and elegance. Its owner is 82-year-old Irene Silverman, a former ballerina and Radio City Music Hall rocket. She is a widow, a vibrant and independent woman who, despite her age and immense wealth, has turned her grand home into a boarding house of sorts, renting out apartments to carefully selected tenants. She enjoys the company and the sense of life it brings to the cavernous building. In June of that year, a new tenant moved into one of her apartments. He was a quiet, unassuming man in his early 20s calling himself Manny Guerin. He paid his rent in cash. He was, in fact, the first move in a deadly endgame, the scout for a predator who had just set her sights on Irene Silverman's home. His real name was Kenneth Kimes Jr., and he was not acting alone. He was acting on the orders of his mother. To understand the disappearance and murder of Irene Silverman, one must first understand the life and crimes of Sante Kimes. Born Sante Singers in 1934, she was a woman who spent her entire life constructing a false identity. She was a chameleon, a grifter, a pathological liar, and a sociopath of breathtaking ambition. From a young age, she engaged in petty crimes, shoplifting, and fraud. She married her high school sweetheart, but left him for a wealthier man, Kenneth Kimes Sr., a self-made motel and construction magnate. With his money and her lack of conscience, she escalated her criminal endeavors. Her rap sheet, compiled over decades under dozens of aliases, reads like a primer in escalating sociopathy. Insurance fraud, arson, forgery, and even a conviction for slavery in the 1980s for keeping undocumented maids as virtual prisoners in her home. Sante was a master manipulator. She could be charming and vivacious one moment, a venomous, raging tyrant the next. She schooled her two sons in her criminal philosophy, which she called her street-smart education. Her older son, Kent, eventually escaped her toxic influence. But her younger son, Kenneth Jr., born in 1975, became her masterpiece. Kenny Kimes adored his mother. From his earliest years, she was the sun in his universe, the source of all light and warmth. He saw her not as a criminal, but as a brilliant, powerful woman fighting against a world that was trying to keep her down. Sante, in turn, molded him into her perfect accomplice. She isolated him, taught him that the only people he could trust were his parents, and that the world was full of enemies. She trained him to lie, to steal, to forge documents. He was her little monkey, her enforcer, her shadow. When his father, Kenneth Sr., died in 1994, the twisted, codependent bond between mother and son intensified. They became a two-person crime family, a modern-day Bonnie and Clyde, bound not by romantic love, but by a dark, almost incestuous devotion. After the death of Kenneth Sr., Sante and Kenny embarked on a cross-country crime spree. They were ghosts, moving from state to state, leaving a trail of fraud and suspicion in their wake. Their primary grift was real estate fraud. They would target wealthy, elderly individuals, insinuate themselves into their lives, and then, through a complex web of forged deeds and fake identities, steal their homes. Their methods brought them to a man named David Kasdan. Kasdan was a longtime friend and business associate of the Kimes family. Sante believed he had cheated her out of money and, more importantly, he knew too much about her fraudulent activities. In 1998, Kenny Kimes lured the 63-year-old Kasdan to his home near Los Angeles. There, Kenny shot him in the back of the head, killing him instantly. He then wrapped the body in garbage bags and dumped it in a construction dumpster. It was Kenny's first murder, a gruesome rite of passage performed for his mother. The motive was simple: to silence a threat and to gain control of a property Kasdan owned, which they intended to use as collateral for a loan to buy a new car. The murder of David Kasdan was a rehearsal. It proved to Kenny that he could kill, and it proved to Sante that her son would do anything for her. Now they were ready for their biggest score yet: Irene Silverman's New York townhouse. In June 1998, the plan was set in motion. Kenny, using the alias Manny Guerin, rented the $6,000 a month first-floor apartment in Silverman's home. Sante, using the alias Eva, the name of the new tenant's personal assistant, began to operate from a nearby motel. The goal was multifaceted. First, they spied on Irene Silverman, learning her routines, her habits, and the layout of her home. Kenny would bug her phone and record her calls. Sante would call her, posing as a potential buyer for the townhouse, to gauge her interest in selling. Their ultimate plan was to get Silverman to sign a forged deed, transferring ownership of the multimillion-dollar property to a holding company controlled by Sante. Irene Silverman, however, was no fool. She was a shrewd and worldly woman. She grew suspicious of her new tenant and his evasive assistant. She noticed his strange hours and the odd way he avoided her. She told her staff she intended to evict him. Sante and Kenny realized their con was failing. Time was running out. They decided to escalate. If they could not get the house by fraud, they would get it by force. On Sunday, July 5, 1998, Irene Silverman vanished. She missed a Sunday night dinner appointment, something she would never do. Her staff, deeply concerned, found her bed undisturbed and her keys and money still in her room. They immediately called the police. The NYPD investigation, led by detectives Tommy Dades and Michael Rubino, quickly focused on the mysterious tenant in apartment 1B. When they questioned Kenny Kimes, he was calm and cooperative, but his story was full of holes. He claimed to know nothing about Silverman's disappearance. But the police were suspicious. The timing was too perfect. An FBI task force, which had been tracking the Kimeses for their previous financial crimes, was alerted. They now had a prime suspect in a potential homicide. The key to breaking the case came from an unrelated crime. The Kimeses had purchased a Lincoln Town car using a fraudulent check. On the very day Irene Silverman disappeared, the FBI task force was closing in on them for that specific crime. An arrest warrant was issued for Sante and Kenny Kimes. They were located outside the Hilton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan. As a swarm of federal agents and NYPD detectives descended, Sante reacted with theatrical outrage, feigning a heart attack. Kenny remained eerily calm. The arrest was the turning point. Inside their Lincoln Town car, investigators found a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. There were wigs, masks, plastic handcuffs, and a loaded 9mm handgun. Most damningly, they found Irene Silverman's personal effects, her keys, her passports, and cassette tapes of her secretly recorded phone calls. They also found dozens of notebooks, handwritten by Kenny. These notebooks were his ledgers of crime, meticulously detailing their scams, their aliases, and their plans. One chilling entry appeared to be a to-do list for the day Silverman disappeared. It included items like, get stun gun, get black bags, and put us on hands to knock out. And then there was the deed. They found a forged deed of sale for the 65th Street townhouse, transferring ownership to Sante Kimes. The signature of Irene Silverman was a clumsy forgery. They now had motive, means, and a mountain of circumstantial evidence. What they didn't have was a body. The trial of Sante and Kenny Kimes began in New York in early 2000. It was a media spectacle. Sante, confined to a wheelchair she often didn't need, was a disruptive and combative presence in the courtroom. She would shout objections, accuse the judge of bias, and deliver rambling, nonsensical monologues. She acted as her own lawyer for part of the trial, a disastrous performance that only served to highlight her manipulative and narcissistic personality. Kenny, by contrast, was silent and stoic, his face a blank mask, his eyes fixed on his mother. The prosecution, facing the challenge of a nobody murder case, systematically built a wall of evidence around the pair. They presented the contents of the car, the notebooks, and the testimony of Silverman's staff. They demonstrated the Kimes' long history of fraud and deception. They argued that the only logical conclusion was that Irene Silverman had been murdered for her home. The jury agreed. In May 2000, Sante and Kenny Kimes were both found guilty of the murder of Irene Silverman, as well as numerous other charges including conspiracy, forgery, and robbery. They were sentenced to life in prison, with Sante receiving a sentence of 120 years and Kenny 125 years. But the story was not over. California authorities still wanted to prosecute them for the murder of David Kasdan, whose body had been found shortly after his disappearance. Faced with the possibility of the death penalty in California, Kenny Kimes finally broke his silence. His absolute devotion to his mother had finally fractured. In a series of interviews with a journalist and later in court, he confessed to everything. He described in cold, horrifying detail the final hours of Irene Silverman's life. He recounted how he had used a stun gun to incapacitate her, then strangled her in her bathroom while his mother held her down. He explained how they had wrapped her body in black garbage bags, stuffed it into a duffel bag, and driven it to a rented apartment in Hoboken, New Jersey. There, he dismembered her body in the bathtub, placed the parts back in the bags, and drove them out into the New Jersey countryside, where he deposited them in a dumpster. Irene Silverman's body was never recovered, likely buried forever beneath tons of refuse in a Pennsylvania landfill. Kenny's confession secured him a plea deal in California, sparing him the death penalty. He pleaded guilty to the murder of David Kasdan and was sentenced to life without parole. As part of his plea, he agreed to testify against his mother in her California trial. In 2004, Sante Kimes was convicted of the murder of David Kasdan and was also sentenced to life without parole. Sante Kimes died in prison in 2014, a manipulative, narcissistic force of nature silenced at last. Kenny Kimes remains incarcerated, a man forever defined by the monstrous acts he committed in the service of his mother's greed. The case of Sante and Kenny Kimes is more than just a story of murder for inheritance. It is a chilling portrait of a folie à deux, a shared madness between a mother and son. It is a testament to the power of a pathological parent to corrupt and weaponize their own child. Sante Kimes did not just give birth to a son. She forged a tool for her own avarice, a human weapon deployed to steal, to terrorize, and ultimately to kill. The price of Irene Silverman's magnificent home was not just her life, but the soul of the young man who took it for his mother. Case 2. The Menendez Brothers. We now travel from the grimy, transient world of the Kimeses to the sun-drenched, manicured opulence of Beverly Hills, California. It is here, in a world of sprawling mansions, luxury cars, and dynastic wealth, that one of the most infamous and sensational crimes of the 20th century took place. This is not a story of outsiders preying on the rich. This is a story of insiders, of two sons who turned on their own parents in an act of shocking, methodical violence. This is the story of Lyle and Eric Menendez. The date is August 20th, 1989. On a quiet Sunday night, in their $4 million Spanish-style mansion on Elm Drive, Jose and Kitty Menendez were relaxing in the family's television room. Jose, 45, was a self-made, hard-driving entertainment executive, the CEO of Live Entertainment, a video distribution company. Kitty, 47, was a former beauty queen turned homemaker. To the outside world, they were the embodiment of the American dream, a wealthy, powerful, and picture-perfect family. They had two handsome, athletic sons, Lyle, who was 21, and Eric, who was 18. That night, as Jose and Kitty sat on the couch, eating bowls of ice cream and strawberries while watching a movie, their two sons burst into the room. They were armed with 12-gauge shotguns. What followed was not a brief, impulsive act of violence. It was a brutal, systematic execution. Lyle fired the first shot, hitting his father in the back of the head, killing him instantly. Eric, frozen for a moment in terror, then began firing at his mother as she tried to scramble away. The brothers fired at least 15 shots in total. The scene was one of almost unimaginable carnage. To ensure their parents were dead, Lyle delivered a final, point-blank shot to his father's face, rendering him unrecognizable. To make the crime look like a mob hit, they shot both of their parents in the kneecaps. They then meticulously gathered the spent shotgun shells, drove to Mulholland Drive, and tossed the guns into a canyon. After disposing of the weapons, they drove to a local movie theater to buy tickets for the next showing of the new James Bond film, License to Kill. This was to be their alibi. A short time later, Lyle made a frantic, hysterical phone call to 911. "Somebody killed my parents," he screamed. When the police arrived at the mansion, they found Lyle and Eric on the front lawn, seemingly overcome with grief. The two brothers, now orphans, appeared to be the tragic victims of a brutal home invasion. The Beverly Hills Police Department initially treated the case as a professional hit, possibly related to Jose Menendez's sometimes ruthless business dealings. The sheer overkill of the crime scene suggested a level of professional violence that seemed far beyond the scope of a typical robbery. The brothers played the part of grieving sons perfectly. At their parents' funeral, they appeared distraught. Lyle delivered a moving eulogy, praising his father as a man of principle and his mother as a devoted parent. But almost immediately, their behavior began to raise suspicion. In the days and weeks following the murders, the brothers embarked on an extravagant spending spree. They were now the heirs to their parents' estimated $14 million fortune. Lyle bought a new Porsche, a Rolex watch, and a popular local restaurant. Eric hired a personal tennis coach and began competing in tournaments overseas. They threw lavish parties, leased luxury apartments, and traveled the world. Their grief seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a giddy, unseemly sense of liberation and entitlement. Detectives began to watch them very closely. The theory of a mob hit was fading, replaced by the darker, more intimate suspicion that the killers were the sons themselves. For months, however, the police had no direct evidence linking the brothers to the crime. The murder weapons had not been found. There were no witnesses. The case remained stalled until one of the brothers, crippled by guilt, made a fatal mistake. Eric Menendez was drowning in the psychological aftermath of what he had done. He was plagued by nightmares and anxiety. He sought help from a Beverly Hills psychologist, Dr. L. Jerome Oziel. In a therapy session on October 31, 1989, Eric confessed everything. He described the murders in chilling detail, recounting how he and Lyle had planned and executed their parents. Dr. Oziel, bound by patient confidentiality, could not go to the police. However, he was deeply alarmed. He convinced Eric to bring Lyle to a joint therapy session to discuss the confession. During this session, Lyle, realizing the danger Eric's confession posed, openly threatened Dr. Oziel, warning him to keep silent. This threat, Dr. Oziel later argued, nullified the doctor-patient privilege, as it put his own life and the life of his family in danger. The confession remained a secret for months. The turning point came not from Dr. Oziel, but from his mistress, Judalon Smith. Smith had been present during some of the meetings and had even eavesdropped on the taped sessions between the brothers and the doctor. Fearing for her own safety and feeling betrayed by Oziel, she eventually went to the police in March 1990. She told them everything she knew. Armed with this information, the police arrested Lyle and Eric Menendez for the murder of their parents. The investigation now had a roadmap. They were able to recover the audio tapes of the therapy sessions, which, after a lengthy legal battle, were deemed admissible in court. They also found a receipt for the purchase of two 12-gauge shotguns just days before the murders. The case against the brothers was now overwhelming. The first Menendez trial, which began in 1993, was a national sensation. It was broadcast live on court TV, captivating the nation. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Pamela Bozanik, presented a simple, powerful narrative. This was a case of cold-blooded murder for money. They argued that Lyle and Eric, impatient to inherit their parents' fortune and tired of living under their father's strict control, had planned and carried out the murders with brutal efficiency. They pointed to the brothers' lavish spending spree as clear evidence of their motive. The defense, led by the brilliant and theatrical attorney Leslie Abramson, countered with a bombshell strategy. They admitted that the brothers had killed their parents, but they argued it was not murder. It was self-defense. They claimed that Lyle and Eric were not greedy monsters, but tormented victims who had finally snapped after a lifetime of horrific physical, emotional, and sexual abuse at the hands of their father, Jose. The courtroom became a theater for a dark family psychodrama. Eric and Lyle took the stand and delivered tearful, harrowing testimony. They described their father as a cruel, sadistic tyrant who subjected them to years of abuse, beginning when they were young children. They portrayed their mother, Kitty, as a neurotic, alcoholic, and depressed woman who was aware of the abuse but was too weak and afraid to stop it. They claimed that on the night of the murders, they feared their parents were about to kill them to prevent them from exposing the family's dark secrets. They argued that they had acted out of a desperate, primal fear for their own lives. The defense brought in a parade of witnesses' relatives, friends, and psychological experts to corroborate their claims of a deeply dysfunctional and abusive family environment. They painted a picture of the Menendez household that was starkly at odds with its perfect public image. The prosecution fought back, portraying the abuse allegations as a desperate, fabricated defense, a cynical ploy to manipulate the jury. They argued there was no physical evidence of long-term abuse and that the brothers had never mentioned it to anyone until after their arrest. They pointed out inconsistencies in their stories and argued that the nature of the killings and ambush with shotguns was inconsistent with a sudden act of self-defense. The trial ended in a deadlock. The jury was hopelessly divided. Some believed the prosecution's story of murder for greed, while others were persuaded by the defense's narrative of self-defense born of abuse. Two separate juries, one for each brother, were unable to reach a unanimous verdict. A mistrial was declared. In 1995, the brothers were retried. This time, there was one judge and one jury for both of them. The new judge, Stanley Weisberg, severely restricted the defense's ability to present evidence of the alleged abuse. He ruled that it was largely irrelevant to the question of whether the brothers were in imminent danger on the night of the murders. Without the powerful emotional impact of the abuse testimony, the defense's case was crippled. The prosecution, now led by David Kahn, hammered home the theme of greed. They replayed Lyle's frantic 911 call, arguing it was a masterful acting performance. They detailed the post-murder spending spree. They focused on the brutal execution-style nature of the crime. This time, the strategy worked. In April 1996, the jury found both Lyle and Eric Menendez guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. They also found true the special circumstances of murder for financial gain and murder by lying in wait, which made the brothers eligible for the death penalty. After a penalty phase, the jury recommended a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Menendez case has remained a subject of intense public fascination and debate for decades. It raises profound and uncomfortable questions. Were Lyle and Eric spoiled, greedy sociopaths who killed for an inheritance? Or were they the damaged products of a horrific, hidden family trauma, pushed to an act of ultimate desperation? The truth is likely more complex than either of the stark narratives presented at trial. It is possible for both things to be true, that they were victims of a deeply abusive and toxic family environment, and that their ultimate act was also motivated by a desire for the freedom and wealth that their parents' deaths would bring. The murders may have been the culmination of years of rage and fear, catalyzed by the allure of a $14 million inheritance. The case tore open the facade of the perfect, wealthy family, revealing the potential for darkness and dysfunction that can fester behind the walls of even the most opulent homes. It forced a national conversation about child abuse, the nature of victimhood, and the corrosive power of secrets. For Lyle and Eric Menendez, their inheritance was not just a fortune in dollars, but a life sentence, a permanent legacy as the 2 handsome, wealthy brothers who bought their freedom at the ultimate price. Case 3, the Dana Ewell case. Our story now moves from the coastal glamour of Los Angeles to the sun-baked heart of California's Central Valley. We arrive in Fresno, a city built on agricultural wealth, a place of sprawling ranches and hard-earned fortunes. This is a world where family dynasties are forged not in boardrooms, but in the fertile soil of the earth. It is here that we find the Ewell family, a symbol of self-made success and seemingly of familial devotion. But beneath the surface of this idyllic family portrait, a monstrous ambition was taking root, an ambition that would culminate in a crime of almost unimaginable coldness. The patriarch, Dale Ewell, 59, was the quintessential American success story. He had started with little and, through decades of shrewd investing and hard work, built a multi-million-dollar empire that included a small aircraft sales business and vast tracts of farmland. He was a tough, demanding businessman, known for his meticulous control over his finances. His wife, Glee, 57, was a devoted mother and community figure. They had 2 children who appeared to be the perfect heirs to their fortune. Their daughter, Tiffany, 24, was bright and accomplished, with a master's degree in finance. And then there was their son, Dana, 21 years old. Dana Ewell was the golden boy. He was handsome, charismatic, and intelligent, a student at Santa Clara University. He was known for his sophisticated taste, his expensive clothes, and his articulate, confident demeanor. To friends and family, he was the charming, loving son, the future leader of the Ewell dynasty. But this was a carefully constructed facade. In reality, Dana was a young man consumed by a toxic combination of entitlement and impatience. He loved the trappings of wealth, the cars, the clothes, the status, but he loathed his father's tight-fisted control over the family fortune. He saw the money not as something to be earned, but as his birthright, an inheritance that was being unjustly withheld. In Dana's mind, his parents and sister were not his family. They were the custodians of his wealth, and their lives were the only thing standing between him and the lifestyle he craved. On Easter Sunday, April 19, 1992, the Ewell family was at their riverfront home in Sunnyside, an affluent Fresno neighborhood. They had just returned from a long weekend on the coast. That evening, they were brutally murdered in their home. The crime was not discovered until the next day, Monday, April 20th. Dale's business partner, worried when Dale didn't show up for a meeting, went to the house to check on him. Peering through a window, he saw a body on the floor and immediately called 911. When Fresno County Sheriff's deputies entered the home, they found a scene of shocking violence, but also one of unsettling stillness. Glee Ewell lay dead in the entryway. Dale Ewell was in the living room. Tiffany Ewell was in her bedroom. All three had been shot multiple times with a 9mm pistol. Yet there were no signs of a struggle, no forced entry, no ransacking. The family's guard dog was found unharmed and had apparently not been agitated. Nothing of value seemed to be missing. This was not a robbery gone wrong. This was an assassination. The killer was someone the Ewells knew, someone they trusted enough to let into their home on a quiet holiday evening. Dana Ewell, who had been staying with his girlfriend's family in Fresno that weekend, was informed of the tragedy. His performance as the grieving son began immediately. He appeared shocked and devastated, the sole survivor of a horrific tragedy. The community rallied around him, the handsome, orphaned heir to a fortune now stained with blood. But investigators, led by Sheriff Sergeant John Souza and Detective Chris Curtis, quickly noted a deeply unsettling quality in Dana's grief. He was almost too composed, too articulate. His questions were not about the search for the killer, but about the will, the estate, the financial paperwork. Within days of his family's slaughter, he was at his father's office, trying to gain access to financial records, displaying a chilling preoccupation with the assets he was now set to inherit. The investigators' suspicion of Dana hardened almost immediately. The crime scene screamed inside job, and the sole beneficiary was the son who showed more interest in the money than in mourning his family. But they had a problem. Dana had a rock-solid alibi. He had been with his girlfriend and her family the entire night of the murders. He could not have been the triggerman. If Dana was the mastermind, he had an accomplice. The investigation became a slow, methodical process of peeling back the layers of Dana Ewell's life. They learned of his grandiose stories, his lies about being a financial genius, and his constant complaints to friends about his father's stinginess. They discovered that the family estate was worth an estimated $8 million. The motive was clear: pure, unadulterated greed. The challenge was to find the hand that held the gun. Detectives began to scrutinize Dana's closest associates, focusing on his life at Santa Clara University. It was there they found him, Joel Radovsik. Joel was Dana's college roommate and best friend. He was smart and capable, but he came from a modest, middle-class background. He was dazzled by Dana's wealth and charisma. Dana was the confident, popular leader. Joel was the loyal, impressionable follower. Dana had promised Joel a lucrative job in the Ewell family business after college. He had showered him with gifts and attention. He had cultivated a deep and powerful influence over him. Investigators theorized that Dana had exploited Joel's loyalty and his desire for a better life, manipulating him into becoming his paid assassin. Proving this theory, however, was another matter. They had no physical evidence linking Joel to the crime scene. The investigation stalled for more than a year. The detectives knew Dana and Joel were responsible, but they couldn't prove it. The breakthrough came not from a witness, but from the murder weapon itself. The detectives learned from ballistics that the bullets used to kill the Ewells were fired from a specific, high-end type of 9mm assault pistol. More importantly, They determined that the killer had used a homemade silencer. The crime lab found microscopic traces of tennis ball fuzz and carpet fibers on the shell casings found at the scene. It was a bizarre, amateurish detail, but it was a crucial clue. It meant they were looking for a specific type of gun and a specific type of silencer. For months, federal agents and local detectives painstakingly followed the trail of every such weapon sold on the West Coast. The search was a needle in a haystack. Finally, their relentless work paid off. They traced a weapon to a man in Los Angeles named Ernest Jack Ponce. When they questioned Ponce, he admitted that he had sold a 9mm pistol to a college kid named Joel Radovsky. He also told them something that made the blood run cold. Joel had specifically asked him how to build a silencer, and Ponce had casually suggested using a tennis ball and some carpet padding. The detectives now had their link. They had the gun and they had the silencer. They knew Joel was their triggerman, but they still needed to tie him directly to Dana. They decided to use Jack Ponce to set a trap. They convinced Ponce, in exchange for immunity, to wear a wire and meet with Joel. In February 1995, nearly 3 years after the murders, Ponce met with Radovsky in a bugged hotel room. The resulting conversation, secretly recorded, was the final piece of the puzzle. Joel, nervous and paranoid, admitted to his role in the killings. He complained that Dana hadn't paid him the money he was promised. He described the murders, confirming that he had gone to the Ewell house, that Dana had given him the floor plan, the security codes, and specific instructions on how to carry out the executions. He had followed the plan to the letter. He was the hand, but Dana was the mind. On the basis of the tapes, Dana Ewell and Joel Radovsky were arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The subsequent trial, which began in 1997, laid bare the chilling details of the plot. The prosecution portrayed Dana as a human monster, a sociopathic mastermind who viewed his own family as nothing more than inconvenient obstacles between him and his inheritance. They presented a mountain of financial evidence, the testimony of friends who recounted Dana's manipulative behavior, the journey of the gun from Ponce to Joel, and the damning audio tapes. The defense attorneys tried to argue that Joel had acted alone, or that the police had coerced the confession from Ponce. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury saw Dana for what he was, a cold, calculating killer who had treated his family's murder as a business transaction. In May 1998, after a lengthy trial, both Dana Ewell and Joel Radovsky were found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury also found true the special circumstance of murder for financial gain. Both men were sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Dana Ewell case stands as a horrifying monument to sociopathic greed. It is distinct from the passionate, abuse-fueled rage of the Menendez case. There were no allegations of abuse in the Ewell family. There was no mitigating trauma. There was only a cold, reptilian desire for money. Dana Ewell did not kill in a fit of anger. He drew up a business plan. He identified his targets: his mother, his father, his sister. He outsourced the wet work to a loyal subordinate. And then he waited to collect on his investment. His crime was the ultimate act of predatory capitalism, where human lives were merely assets to be liquidated for profit. He remains in prison today, a man who successfully inherited his family's fortune, but at the cost of his own humanity, a price he seems to have paid without a moment's hesitation. Case 4: The Murdaugh Family Fraud and Murders. We end our journey in the humid, moss-draped lowcountry of South Carolina. This is a region with a deep and complex history, a place where family names carry the weight of generations, and where power, justice, and money are often intertwined in a dark, Gothic tapestry. For over a century, one name held more power than any other in this corner of the state: Murdaugh. The Murdaughs were not just a family. They were an institution. They were a legal dynasty that controlled the local solicitor's office, the chief prosecutor, for 3 consecutive generations, spanning 87 years. They ran a prestigious and powerful civil law firm. To be a Murdaugh was to be above the law, to be part of a system of influence and privilege that seemed untouchable. This story is about the spectacular, violent, and tragic collapse of that dynasty, orchestrated by the man who was supposed to be its proudest heir. Richard Alex Murdaugh, born in 1968, was the scion of this powerful family. He was a prominent attorney at the family law firm, a man who moved through the world with the easy, confident swagger of someone who had never faced a consequence he couldn't buy, bully, or charm his way out of. He lived a life of immense privilege on a sprawling 1,700-acre estate known as Moselle. He was married to his college sweetheart, Maggie, 52, and they had 2 sons, Buster and Paul. From the outside, Alex Murdaugh was the epitome of Southern gentility and power. But this was a carefully maintained illusion. Behind the stately facade, Alex Murdaugh was a man living a secret, desperate life. He was a severe, long-term opioid addict, a habit that cost him tens of thousands of dollars a week. And to fund this addiction and his lavish lifestyle, he was a prolific, systematic thief. For years, he had been stealing millions of dollars from his own law firm and from the vulnerable clients he was supposed to be representing: accident victims, grieving families, and people with disabilities. He would divert their settlement funds into his own secret bank accounts, leaving them with pennies on the dollar or nothing at all. He was a financial predator, hiding in plain sight, protected by the power of his family name. By the spring of 2021, Alex Murdaugh's 2 worlds, the respectable lawyer and the desperate addict and thief, were on a catastrophic collision course. The walls were closing in. His law firm was beginning to suspect financial misconduct. More urgently, the family was facing a wrongful death lawsuit that threatened to expose his financial crimes to the world. This lawsuit stemmed from a tragic boat crash in 2019. His younger son, Paul Murdaugh, then 19, had allegedly been drinking and driving the family boat when it crashed, killing one of his friends, a 19-year-old woman named Mallory Beach. Paul was facing criminal charges of boating under the influence causing death. The civil lawsuit filed by the Beach family sought to hold Alex responsible for his son's actions. A crucial hearing was scheduled for June 10, 2021. At this hearing, Alex Murdaugh was going to have to produce his financial records. This was the moment of reckoning. The discovery process would inevitably uncover the millions he had stolen. The exposure of his fraud would mean financial ruin, disbarment, social disgrace, and almost certainly prison. His entire world was about to implode. On the night of June 7, 2021, just 3 days before that fateful court hearing, Alex Murdaugh made a 911 call from his Moselle estate. He sounded hysterical. He told the dispatcher that he had just returned home to find his wife and son shot. "I've been gone," he cried. "I just came back." When police arrived at the dog kennels on the sprawling property, they found a brutal and bloody scene. Maggie Murdaugh had been shot multiple times with an assault-style rifle. Paul Murdaugh had been shot twice with a shotgun, the second shot to his head at close range, a wound so catastrophic it was instantly fatal. The double murder of a prominent lawyer's wife and son shocked the state of South Carolina. The initial narrative, fueled by Alex and his defense team, was that the Murdaughs were the victims of some unknown assailant, perhaps someone seeking revenge for the boat crash, or an enemy from one of Alex's legal cases. The community was gripped by fear, but investigators from the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, or SLED, were immediately suspicious of Alex Murdaugh. His grief seemed performative. His story about his whereabouts that night was vague and inconsistent, and as they delved into his life, they began to uncover the vast, hidden world of his financial crimes. A powerful motive began to emerge. Alex Murdaugh, the prosecution would later argue, was a desperate man facing imminent exposure. He had tried to delay the boat crash lawsuit hearing, but failed. He was out of options. So he concocted a monstrous, almost unthinkable plan. He would murder his own wife and son. Why? To create a colossal distraction. The brutal, tragic murder of his family would generate a wave of sympathy for him, the grieving husband and father. It would delay the boat crash hearing indefinitely. It would buy him time to try and cover his financial tracks. He saw his wife and son not as family, but as collateral damage, pawns to be sacrificed in a desperate, last-ditch attempt to save himself. For over a year, Alex Murdaugh maintained his innocence, playing the role of the heartbroken victim. But the investigators were building their case piece by piece. The financial evidence was a mountain. And then they found the digital smoking gun. Alex had told police that he had not been at the dog kennels that evening. He claimed he had taken a nap at the main house and then driven to visit his ailing mother, only discovering the bodies upon his return. This was his alibi. But investigators found a crucial video on Paul Murdaugh's cell phone. It was a short video of a dog, recorded at the kennels just minutes before the murders are believed to have occurred. In the background of that video, 3 distinct voices can be heard: Paul's, Maggie's, and, unmistakably, the voice of Alex Murdaugh. This video completely shattered his alibi. It placed him at the scene of the crime with the victims in the moments just before they were killed. In July 2022, more than a year after the murders, Alex Murdaugh was arrested and charged with the murders of his wife and son. The trial, which began in early 2023, became a global media event. It was a sprawling, complex saga of power, corruption, and a spectacular fall from grace. The prosecution, led by the unflappable Creighton Waters, laid out their theory of the crime. They presented the damning financial evidence, meticulously detailing the millions of dollars Alex had stolen over the years. They presented the cell phone video, proving he had lied about his whereabouts. They argued that the murders were the desperate, final act of a con man whose schemes were about to be exposed. The defense, led by the legendary Dick Harpootlian, argued that the state's case was purely circumstantial. They pointed out that the murder weapons had never been found. There was no direct physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints linking Alex to the killings. They tried to portray the investigation as incompetent and biased, suggesting that SLED had immediately focused on Alex and ignored other potential leads, like a vigilante seeking revenge for the boat crash. The climax of the trial came when Alex Murdaugh himself decided to take the stand. It was a massive gamble. For 2 days, he was cross-examined by the prosecution. On the stand, he admitted for the first time that he had lied to police about his whereabouts on the night of the murders. He admitted he was at the kennels. The reason he lied, he claimed, was because of his opioid addiction, which he said induced a state of paranoia. But he vehemently denied killing his wife and son. "I would never hurt my wife, Maggie," he wept. "And I would never hurt my son, Paw." His performance was a mix of tears, anger, and folksy Southern charm. But the jury saw through it. His admission that he had lied about his alibi, the cornerstone of his defense for nearly 2 years, destroyed his credibility. On March 2, 2023, after less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury found Alex Murdaugh guilty of the murders of Maggie and Paul Murdaugh. The next day, he was sentenced to 2 consecutive terms of life in prison. The Murdaugh saga is a story that feels almost Shakespearean in its Scopia tale of a fallen king whose kingdom was built on a foundation of lies. It is a story about the corrosive nature of unchecked power and the corrupting influence of generational privilege. But at its heart, it is a simple, brutal story of greed. Alex Murdaugh did not kill for an inheritance in the traditional sense. He already had immense wealth and status. He killed to protect the illusion of that wealth, to preserve a life built on fraud. He killed to prevent a financial reckoning. The ultimate price for his years of theft was not paid by him, but by the two people who should have been most precious to him, his wife and his son, executed on a summer night to buy a liar a little more time. The stories of Sante Kimes, the Menendez brothers, Dana Ewell, and Alex Murdaugh paint a chilling portrait of greed in its most monstrous form. They show us that the desire for wealth, or the desperate fear of losing it, can become a motive powerful enough to sever the most sacred of human bonds. These were not crimes of passion. They were, in their own ways, business transactions, where the lives of parents, spouses, siblings, and children were entered as liabilities on a ledger, to be brutally and permanently erased. These cases force us to confront the unsettling truth that the love of money can indeed be the root of a profound and terrifying evil. They serve as a dark mirror, reflecting a world where inheritance is not a gift to be cherished, but a prize to be seized, and where the final cost is measured not in dollars, but in the irretrievable loss of family, humanity, and the soul itself. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. Sleep well if you can.